Welcome to the state of Hawaii on the ThinkTech live streaming network series, broadcasting from our downtown studio at 1164 Bishop Street at the core of downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Stephanie Dalton, and joining me remotely today is the Reverend David J. Gierlach, the rector at St. Elizabeth's Episcopal Church on North King Street in Honolulu. Today, we're going to talk about houselessness, focusing on the question, is it a recoverable community condition, or does this constituency become our new normal? As I said, our guests, welcome to Reverend David Gierlach from St. Elizabeth's Church, and also chair of Hawaii's Public Housing Authority Board of Directors. As you know, the state of Hawaii has the highest rate per capita of homeless people, and that is 487 houseless people per 10,000 people, but that totals 6,530 altogether. The headlines and websites we review are about who has the most homelessness tend to go to awarding Los Angeles, California, because they have 56,257 homeless people, and New York has and reports having 78,604 houseless people. Father David's ministry at St. Elizabeth's faith-based community has welcomed numerous houseless people for years onto the church campus, and they've provided many services such as meals, laundry, showers, clothing, some temporary housing, among many other services. I'd like to welcome Father David, hello, and ask him to tell us more about your ministry to the houseless through your church community's outreach over these past years, and for how long you've been doing that, and what are some of the interesting findings you have to share with us about that work and where it's going.
Thank you, Stephanie. Great to be with you. Just one minor correction. I'm the past chair of the HPA,
Oh, thank you for that.
CHA, under Governor Abercrombie. I don't want anyone to get upset with me.
Oh, the website was pretty far behind. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you, and pardon me, I'm getting over a cold, so I hope we can get through this okay.
Well, let me know if you have any problems. We can break.
Perhaps I need to just to get some water. I didn't realize.
Okay, sure, sure.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
the campus at St. Elizabeth's reflects all continuing effort for the houseless community that visits and some who live there. So over the last few years, there have been some renovations and modifications to the shower areas and to other rooms and buildings that will provide help to those who need it most. Some of the help includes some temporary housing, which the people I've talked to out there have been so grateful for, and are very, very grateful to you for helping them move into the list and have access to permanent housing. So maybe you could tell us a little more about how that's all going.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, our involvement really started when the sit-lie legislation passed, when so many of the houseless were living in Waikiki, which is, of course, the tourism center, and that caused great consternation among the powers that be in our town. And so they were essentially forced out and ended up in the business district, which is just another area of power and money. And we're just north of the business district. And west of the business district, and that's when we began to experience in our neighborhood a great many houseless folks. Something quite new. Certainly, the Kalihi Palama area is a lower income our particular neighborhood is surrounded by public housing, and so we're used to having people of financial challenge nearby, but houselessness was not a real big issue until the sit-lie legislation came to pass. And when it did, we were met with a real crisis because there were families living out of their cars or families with children living in tents on the sidewalk. And so we opened the grounds to families to stay overnight in their cars or to put a tarp up on church grounds just to spend the night, to be in a secure area. They had to leave during the day because there's so many things going on at the church. But we did that for several years. Ultimately, though, it became unsustainable because the folks who were staying there became targets of gang members in the neighborhood. Um, and we had a difficult time getting help from HPD to help police this. Um, and so we ultimately, about 3 years ago, we stopped providing that kind of service to people. We limited it to folks who live in our container. We have a reconstructed shipping container that Faith Action for Community Equity gave to us. We've had dozens of people stay there for relatively short periods of time, 30, 60, 90 days, ideally. We currently have 2 women there who were living on the street behind the church, who are now employed and getting dental work and medical care that they needed and reintegrating into our community very successfully.
Father David, could
We,
you tell us about that sit line law is that you referred to
well, that
earlier in your comments? Yes.
I'd be happy to. I mean, that's something that came up several years ago when houseless folks were living primarily in Waikiki, and that was causing the powers that be to have some significant conniptions about that situation. And so, sit lie means you can't sit or lie on the sidewalk, and if you do, you're subject to arrest. And basically, it gave the authorities the ability to move people onward. The question always has been, well, where do you move to? Because you can simply move from neighborhood to neighborhood, and each neighborhood you enter has the same objections, and we're an island. So where are you going to go? Unless we return to our original habitation in the sea, which isn't too likely. So that is the legislation that caused the issue to kind of arrive at our front door, and that's why we took the action that we took. Since then, though, since we were no longer able to manage keeping the grounds open for folks, we began what's called a Catholic Worker House, founded on the ideals of Dorothy Day, a radical anarchist Roman Catholic woman who started houses of hospitality in the 30s during the Depression. She began this in New York City, and it spread throughout the country and now around the world. And we have Episcopal Third Order of St. Francis lay people who are Catholic workers and who operate this house. And the services they provide involve things like daily canned foods, 2 hot meals a week. Laundry is done for houseless folks. Personal items, particularly important documents, are stored. Mail is received. Devices are charged for them. And we have and try to develop a sense of fellowship with folks. So it's not just a matter of giving and receiving, it's a matter of giving and giving back. And in fact, we're about a week away from dedicating a peace garden that will have many garden areas for people to come and grow things in, as well as hydroponics and aquaponics on the grounds. So those are some of the things we've tried to do. In a way, our faith communities can do what government can does, but just on a very much smaller basis. So we
Do you
kind of,
Well, do you think
yeah, go ahead.
St. Elizabeth's is unique in this offering of service, or are other faith-based communities performing these duties?
Yeah, there's a lot of faith-based communities who are involved with helping people uh, in this situation. We may provide perhaps overall more uh, services than many other churches, certainly not more than all. There are churches that I'm sure do even more than we do. But most churches are involved at some level, whether it's a food pantry or a shower or a bathroom. Um, most churches are quite involved.
Well, What are your learnings from these years of outreach to this constituency? What have you found to be operating principles or the dynamics that are the impediments or and those that are facilitators of
Well,
your needs?
several years ago, the real issue, the most pressing issue, were so many families who were houseless. And you'll remember the hundreds of campers at Kaka'ako Park, and most of those were families. And then that's kind of when the churches banded together with service providers to go and not only give basic necessities like food and hygiene products, but we also coordinated frequent interactions with these folks, with service providers, people who could help them, not so much with employment, because much to our surprise, most of these folks were working and working full time.
Hmm.
But that's what a minimum wage salary full time gets you in Hawaii. It gets you a tent on the sidewalk.
Hmm.
Um, but
So, yeah.
that ended up being quite successful in terms of getting most of those families, I believe, off the streets and into more permanent housing. I think the more durable challenge we have now are many of the what many will call the chronic houseless, many with drug and mental health problems, many who have just been on the streets for so long that returning to something that we would consider to be normal is a real challenge. Um,
Well, I think that those are the kinds of questions that people have about this phenomenon that's growing and pressing for attention and remediation and intervention. I guess I'd like to ask you what do you see as the root causes? I understand you've brought up the minimum pay level, the poverty level payment that or the low minimum wage that they have won't get them places to live in Honolulu. But as I mentioned, Honolulu is hardly the only place with this issue, and other big cities are coping with it too. But what do you see as root causes, fundamental root causes?
well, I think some of the fundamental root causes, one of them has to do with uh, the city and county of Honolulu's housing scandal back in the 80s and 90s, when that was a time when the city was very aggressively helping to develop the Leeward Plain, the Eva Plain. And lots of houses were being built, townhouses, single family homes, with city help so that local people could afford. And then a bunch of corruptions happened, and government officials were getting kickbacks, and contractors were getting bribes, and the whole thing kind of fell apart. And as a result, sadly, the city it disbanded its housing office, and that effort to create a large inventory of housing ended. And for about 20 years after that, almost nothing was done to increase the inventory of what we would call affordable housing, something where somebody making less than 100% of the area median income could afford. So we had this long lag in providing simple inventory that is only now starting to be addressed really late in the game. But the other thing is that it, we don't live in a local economy when it comes to our housing economy. We live in a global economy. We're not just competing with each other, those of us who live here, for homes and properties. We're competing with people from around the world and with money from around the world. And I think as the world has grown more dangerous, at least in perception, because of terrorist attacks or drug cartels, where places like Mexico and other places used to attract lots of people and money and so forth, a lot of that's being directed here to Hawaii. And there's no way we can compete with that, those of us who live here. Um, One solution to that, in my mind, is we need to substantially increase the property tax on offshore purchasers. Already, we have a very low property tax in Hawaii, among the lowest in the nation. That's fine for the residents, but in my view, we should be taxing the bejeebers out of the offshore buyers and using that money then to help with inventory for our local people.
So you see that as a remedy for this. In other words, increase the flow of resources to the city or county, state,
Absolutely. I mean,
certainly the
it's
state.
really not the magic bullet, but it's one bullet among the many that are going to be needed if we're going to remedy this. Things like Stanley Chang's idea of really super high density and long 99-year leases with situations where purchasers can participate in the equity, but the government participates as well. That's very exciting because we do live on an island and we do need more density. Something else we need to think about is that uh, public housing, and most people don't know this, but since the 1980s, the amount of public housing that the federal government is willing to build has been capped. Now, if we had only capped the number of people who are in need of such housing since the 1980s, we'd all be fine. But it's like capping the military budget in the 1980s and expecting it to deal effectively with 2020 realities. We are capped at 1980 levels. So, for example, when Mayor Wright gets rebuilt, which is supposed to happen next year, it's the oldest public housing on the island. It's long outlived its useful life. It doesn't make good use of the 25 acres it sits on because it's so low density. It's going to be redeveloped into multi-income commercial residential residences and businesses, which is going to be wonderful. But the federal government will only pay uh, to rebuild 858 or so units because that's what we had in the 1980s. That's nuts.
So
And
what
these,
about, yeah, how does that interact then with other areas of resource here in Hawaii? In other words, that sounds like that's covered by the federal people. I mean, we have a mayoral race coming up. What do you see that people in this political arena can propose and perhaps perform once they're elected? Do you see any remedies there that will resolve some of this?
I give Mayor Caldwell credit. I think he's done as much as he believes he can, and the current council to increase affordable housing abilities to try to redirect city resources to that. Thankfully, the state has jumped on board with this because the state has vastly more resources. But I am disappointed that I haven't really heard from any of the candidates that we need to increase the property tax for offshore purchasers. Folks in New Jersey spend 20, 30, $40,000 a year on real property taxes, and somehow they manage. And New Jersey, the last I heard, was full of people. Um, I don't think we're going to have any trouble selling our units here to those who can afford them, even if they have to pay significantly more property tax than they are now. And I'd like to hear that from our folks.
Good. Well, I wanted to know about the sharing across the levels, if you know or have a sense of how that occurs. In other words, we started talking about the faith-based communities and the tremendous and overwhelmingly challenging work that people are doing all the time, not just at St. Elizabeth's, as you pointed out. I mean, in early morning breakfast and late night helping out in laundry, and it's a major effort. So, how does this work interact with what the city county's doing and the state? Is there any sharing or cooperation or alignment with regulations or other
Oh yeah,
resources?
there's lots of cooperation going on. I mean, for example, Mark Alexander, who now runs the city's housing office, he's a former religious. So he knows the challenges that we deal with, and he understands how the tools of government work. And he's been tremendously effective in cooperating with lots and lots of faith-based communities to deal with the houseless issue. But one of the fundamental problems is we simply don't have sufficient resources. If every houseless person on the island said, you know what, I want to go into shelter tonight, we don't have nearly enough shelter beds to accommodate them. We don't have anywhere close to the number of drug and alcohol treatment beds that we need. And this means people, not only for shelters, but for drug and alcohol treatment, are on really long waiting lists. And when you get on a waiting list, sometimes you give up and you go back to what's familiar. We should be in a situation where if somebody wants drug or alcohol treatment or wants to be in a shelter bed, we should be able to say yes, and you can go there now. The other issue, I think, has to do with shelters. And I understand why many of them have barriers, and barriers meaning some of them charge a fee, and many houseless don't have money to pay it. or they're spending it on other things. Some don't allow pets. And for many of the houseless, the pet is their last connection to a sense of human decency. Some don't allow you to keep your possessions there during the day. You've got to pack them up and carry them around all day long and come back at night. That's really almost inhuman. And others won't allow drug or alcohol addicted people inside. And I get it. All of these things require additional supervision. They require additional space, time, money, etc. But I think we need to be providing that. And when it comes to the hardest of the hardcore, I'm thinking group homes, closely supervised, available group homes for folks who are kind of at the real bottom of the barrel.
Well, with this notion of cooperation, I mean, often these layers of government are able to cooperate productively through writing reports and collecting data and assessing their progress in these areas. So, are you familiar with the kind of data collection that is going on in Hawaii? Is there an office for this? Is there a major effort to look at what the outcomes are of the dedication and heroic work efforts, what those outcomes are, and how they may be ameliorating homeless in the state or monitoring the return to homelessness when it isn't effective? Do you know about those
Well, yeah,
reports?
I mean, only superficially. There's an annual count of the houseless that brings out all kinds of people to try to count accurately how many houseless we have. Those numbers that you were giving us from Hawaii and New York and LA, that's a result of those kind of annual houseless counts. And that data is crunched and it is used to decide whether we're getting any better. Last I heard, we are not number one per capita in houselessness. New York has exceeded us because we had a decline. Um, but yeah, I think there is that kind of analysis.
Well, it seems that that getting the numbers together and is a way to make the case, of course, through at the federal level for producing more streams of funding this way. I know circumstances right now might not be conducive for that, but eventually it could evoke some lawmaking, like in the Disabilities Act and what they're doing with that Title II to change the way they classify areas where there can be homes made available to people on low incomes, and that
Mm.
I guess they've changed it from just a designation of an area to by zip code section or something that makes it sound like it may give more people some eligibility that didn't have it before or can go in at a
Okay.
lower level because they've redone the
Yeah.
charts for the funding of it. But can you talk any
That I'm
about
not
that?
really familiar with, but I am familiar with a proposal by our Lieutenant Governor, Josh Green, who has suggested using Medicaid funds in a way that would help and use those funds to put people into permanent housing. And the thinking goes like this. If a houseless person's going to the emergency room 5 times in a month, and that's costing $25,000 a month, it's way cheaper to use the Medicaid money that's paying that bill and put this fellow into an apartment for $2,000 a month. And he is making efforts to try to make that happen. This is probably one of the only areas where I might find myself in agreement with some of the Republicans in Washington, where they're talking about giving states more leeway on how to use their monies. I'm sure most states are not going to be as creatively helpful for the poor as ours, but it would be a source of revenue to immediately impact how we deal with folks and to save money.
Yeah. Is there activity on the outer islands that has been successful or informative for what we do here? Can you speak
Yeah,
to
one of
that?
the really cool projects on Maui is something called a cup of cold water that the Episcopal Church began, and then a whole bunch of other denominations jumped in on. And they have a van, and because the houseless in Maui tend to be more scattered, they go to them and bring hygiene and food and clothing and things like that. and have been serving hundreds of people for many years now in a very successful way. I'm not real familiar with what's happening on Kauai or the Big Island, and so I probably won't comment there.
Is Oahu the most impacted in your experience? Is
Oh,
that what
very
you
much
see?
so. Yeah. We're the
That,
population center for the state. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, one of the frightening things for me is to know of how that there are almost 4,000 youngsters, public school student age youngsters, that are impacted by this, either within their families or as independent young people out there being houseless. Um, eh, what efforts are being made to get these people to school? Because that, of course, is the main detriment is that their attendance falls, and that leads to the usual
Right.
cascade and ultimately poverty. So, and any comments on what's happening with the youngsters, public school
Well, only
youngsters?
that it's a complete tragedy. And of course, as the city conducts these street sweeps where people are swept, uh, and oftentimes important documents are gone, not driver's licenses and birth certificates and homework. And then once they're swept from a particular area, they have to go somewhere else. And oftentimes that means a child doesn't return to the same school. So, yeah, it's a travesty.
Well, it sounds overwhelming. I think we all have that impression out here in the public, but we knowing of these enormous efforts and good ideas and recommendations and the kind of outreach that we should make to our politicians, as you've mentioned, the changes, in the minimum wage and getting more money streams. It would be that makes us look like there are things we can do, and it sounds like
Well,
you're
and
doing.
one other major issue, I think, is the whole issue of income inequality. And that needs to be addressed. There's way too many people at the bottom and way too few at the top. We're in a gilded age right now. And I think that can only be remedied through significant federal tax reform, frankly.
Thank you. Okay, we're out of time on this topic and we'll have to wrap it up. I'm Stephanie Dalton. This show is the state of Hawaii on the Think Tech live streaming network series. And we've been talking with Reverend David J. Gierlach about houselessness and is it a recoverable community condition or does this constituency become the new normal? Thanks to you all for tuning in, being here. Thank you again, Father David. If you want to get our email and social media program advisories, please click the link on thinktechhawaii.com. If you'd like to be a guest, underwriter, or volunteer, or if you want to join us in our downtown studio, contact Jay at thinktechhawaii.com. If you want the links to our live streams or our previous broadcasts on thinktech.com, you can see them on youtube.com. Just go to thinktechhawaii.com. Go there to our Facebook page and tell them you like us. We'd love you to like us. And of course, I'll see you again 2 weeks from now for more of the state of Hawaii on Think Tech. I'm Stephanie. Thank you. Aloha, everyone.